A girl claims she found her twin at school. Her mom sees the other girl and breaks into tears, and two identical faces, one impossible truth. Why were they separated? Who's been hiding the past? And what happens when everything finally comes out? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Emma's patent leather shoes clicked against the smooth driveway as she stepped out of the Blacktown car. The September breeze rustled through the perfectly manicured maple trees lining their modern home, carrying with it the first hints of autumn. She adjusted her navy blazer, a familiar comfort against the afternoon chill, though today even her crisp uniform felt somehow different on her skin. Heavier, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. "Thank you, James," she said quietly to their driver, her voice lacking its usual cheerful lilt. He nodded with a concerned glance in the rearview mirror before pulling away. Inside, the house wrapped around her with its familiar warmth. The kitchen gleamed with its white marble countertops and stainless steel appliances, everything in its proper place, just as it always was. The gentle whistle of the kettle pierced the silence, and Emma could smell the soothing scent of chamomile wafting through the air, a fragrance that normally calmed her racing thoughts. Susan Langford stood at the counter, her cream silk blouse and tailored pants as pristine as the kitchen around her. Her shoulder-length brown hair fell in soft waves, and her movements were graceful as she prepared their afternoon tea. This was their ritual, their special time together. But today, Emma's feet felt heavy as she made her way to her usual spot at the kitchen island. She slid onto the stool without her typical eager bounce. "How was school today, sweetheart?" Susan asked, setting down Emma's favorite blue ceramic mug, the one with tiny golden stars around the rim. Steam curled up from the perfectly steeped tea, just the way Emma liked it, 3 minutes exactly, with a splash of milk and half a teaspoon of honey. Emma stared at the mug, her fingers tracing its warm surface but not lifting it to drink. The silence stretched between them, unusual for a girl who typically bubbled over with stories about her day, chattering about everything from science experiments to playground politics. "Emma?" Susan's voice held a note of concern now. She placed her own mug down and leaned forward slightly, her maternal instincts picking up on her daughter's unusual demeanor. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped once against the counter before she stilled them. "I saw myself today," Emma finally said, her words barely above a whisper, eyes still fixed on the swirling tea. Susan's brow furrowed slightly, though she maintained her composed expression. "What do you mean, dear?" She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a small gesture that betrayed her unease. Emma's hands tightened around her mug. "There's a new girl in my class. Maya." She swallowed hard, her next words coming out in a rush. "Mom, she looks exactly like me. Not just a little bit, exactly like me. It was like someone had copied me and pasted me into another seat." "Oh, sweetheart," Susan said with a gentle smile, though something flickered in her eyes, a shadow of worry quickly masked. "You know there are plenty of girls who might share similar features." "No," Emma interrupted, something she rarely did. "You don't understand. It's not just that she looks like me, it's like—" She struggled to find the words, her usually perfect posture slumping slightly. "It's like looking in a mirror. The same face, the same eyes, even the way she holds herself when she sits. She even has that little freckle right above her left eyebrow, just like mine." Susan took a careful sip of her tea, her movements measured and controlled. The delicate china clinked softly as she set it down. "Well, that must have been quite a surprise. Is she nice? Perhaps you two could become friends." But Emma wasn't ready to let go. "She looked at me, Mom. When Mrs. Peterson introduced her to the class, our eyes met and—" Emma's voice trembled slightly. "She already knew me, I could tell. She looked at me like she knew exactly who I was. Not like someone meeting a stranger, but like she was seeing someone she'd lost." Susan set her mug down with a slightly sharper clink than usual. "Emma, dear, I'm sure this is all just a coincidence. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us when we're surprised by something unexpected. You know how creative your imagination can be. But Mom, why don't you tell me about the rest of your day?" Susan suggested. her tone gentle but firm, the way she always redirected conversations toward safer ground. "Did you have that history quiz you were preparing for? The one about the American Revolution?" Emma's shoulders slumped further, recognizing the familiar way her mother redirected conversations she didn't want to have. She picked up her spoon and stirred her untouched tea, watching the liquid swirl into a tiny whirlpool. "Yes," she answered quietly. "I think I did well. We had to write about the Declaration of Independence." The conversation drifted to safer topics: homework assignments, upcoming piano recitals, weekend plans. But Emma's thoughts kept returning to Maya. To those eyes that had looked back at her with such recognition, to the way Maya's hands had folded in her lap, exactly as Emma's did when she was nervous. To the strange feeling that had settled in her stomach the moment their eyes met. Not fear, exactly, but something deeper, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Susan lay awake in her king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling. The master bedroom was bathed in moonlight filtering through the gauzy curtains, creating shadows that seemed to dance across the walls like ghostly figures with stories to tell. Despite the comfortable temperature, a chill ran through her body as Emma's words echoed in her mind. "She already knew me." Susan turned onto her side, pulling the Egyptian cotton sheets closer around her shoulders, seeking comfort in their luxurious weight. Down the hall, she could imagine Emma sleeping peacefully in her room, surrounded by her collection of stuffed animals and the soft purple walls they'd picked out together when she was 7. Everything in its place. Everything as it should be. Everything perfect and controlled, just as Susan had always ensured it would be. But Emma's words wouldn't leave her alone. They hung in the darkness like an unwelcome guest, refusing to be dismissed. "She already knew me." The sentence played over and over in Susan's mind, each repetition carrying a weight that seemed to press harder against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She lay there in the quiet house, listening to the gentle hum of the central air system and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, just as every doubt she'd pushed away during the day now demanded her attention, crowding around her bed like shadows with voices of their own. The morning sun cast long shadows across Susan's immaculate kitchen as she deliberately left Emma's purple lunchbox on the counter. Her daughter had already left for school, driven by James in their usual morning routine. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the container, knowing it was just a prop in her carefully constructed plan. The weight of it felt both familiar and strange in her grip, a mother's everyday item transformed into something more significant. She chose her outfit with precision, a cream-colored blazer and tailored navy slacks that projected both authority and approachability. Her pearl earrings caught the light as she checked her reflection one last time, tucking a stray blonde hair back into place. She pinched color into her cheeks, trying to mask the sleepless night that had left shadows under her eyes. The drive to St. Agnes Academy felt longer than usual. Susan's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel as she rehearsed her excuse in her head. The school's Gothic architecture loomed ahead, its brick facade both familiar and suddenly imposing. She pulled into a visitor's parking spot, gathering her courage before stepping out of her Mercedes. The car door closed with a solid thunk that matched the heaviness in her chest. Inside, the hallways buzzed with typical middle school energy. Students in navy blazers and plaid skirts darted between classes, their voices echoing off the polished floors. Susan clutched Emma's lunchbox closer, her designer handbag swinging at her elbow as she moved through the corridor. The familiar scent of floor polish and adolescent perfume filled her nostrils. Her eyes scanned each young face methodically, heart pounding with every dark-haired girl who passed. The sea of uniforms made it harder to distinguish one student from another, but Susan pressed on, maintaining her composed exterior while anxiety churned inside her stomach. She nodded politely at teachers who recognized her from parent meetings, all while continuing her search. Then, without warning, time seemed to slow. A girl stood at an open locker, her back turned to Susan. Those curls, Susan would know them anywhere. They were the same ones she carefully pinned back for Emma every morning. The same subtle wave, the same rich brown color. She felt her breath catch in her throat, frozen in place among the flowing river of students. The girl turned and Susan's world tilted on its axis. It was Emma's face, but it wasn't Emma. Same delicate nose, same arch of the eyebrows, same warm brown eyes. But where Emma's expression usually carried a careful politeness, this girl's face held something different, a guardedness, a wariness that Emma had never known. There was a hardness there, an edge that spoke of experiences Susan couldn't begin to imagine. Susan's designer handbag slipped from her grip, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Her lipstick and phone scattered across the polished tiles, drawing curious glances from passing students. A tube of expensive makeup rolled to a stop against a locker. "Are you all right, ma'am?" A teacher in a cardigan rushed forward, concern etched on her face. "Let me help you with that." She bent down, gathering Susan's belongings with efficient movements. But Susan couldn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on Maya, who had already turned away, closing her locker with a quiet click before disappearing into the stream of students. The girl vanished around a corner, unaware of the earthquake she'd just caused in Susan's reality. I need... Susan's voice came out barely above a whisper. She backed away from the helpful teacher, her heels clicking against the floor as she searched frantically for the nearest bathroom. She mumbled a quick thank you, clutching her retrieved items against her chest. The staff restroom door provided blessed privacy. Susan's hands shook as she turned the lock, then gripped the edge of the white porcelain sink. Her reflection in the mirror showed a face drained of color. She turned on the cold water, splashing it against her cheeks, not caring about her carefully applied makeup. Mascara ran in thin rivulets down her face. "Get it together," she whispered to herself, watching water drip from her chin. "Get it together, Susan." The words echoed in the small, tiled room, sounding hollow even to her own ears. After 5 long minutes of deep breathing and reapplying her lipstick, Susan emerged from the bathroom with renewed purpose. Her heels struck the floor with determination as she made her way to the school office. Each step felt more certain than the last, propelled by a mother's instinct that something profound had just happened. The receptionist looked up with a practiced smile. "May I help you, Mrs. Langford?" "I need to speak with the school counselor," Susan said, her voice steady despite the tremor still running through her body. "Immediately." She placed both hands flat on the counter to steady herself. "I'm afraid Mrs. Martinez is in a session right now." "This can't wait." Susan leaned forward, dropping her voice. "It's about Maya Green. I need to know who she is, and I need to speak with her guardian. Today." The urgency in her tone left no room for argument. The receptionist's smile faltered at Susan's intensity. "Let me see what I can do." She picked up her phone, speaking in hushed tones while Susan paced the small waiting area. The tick of the wall clock seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Minutes stretched like hours as Susan waited, her mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. She had known Emma was adopted, had been there for every step of the process. But this was something else entirely, something that made her stomach twist with dread and her heart pound with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Finally, the receptionist cleared her throat. "Mrs. Langford, please have a seat. We've made some calls and..." She paused, checking her computer screen. "Danielle Green is on her way." Susan sank into one of the stiff office chairs, her legs suddenly weak. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet office, marking each moment that brought her closer to answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. She clutched Emma's purple lunchbox in her lap like a talisman, her fingertips turning white from the pressure. The small office at St. Agnes Academy felt even smaller as Danielle Green entered, her presence commanding the space without effort. Her charcoal gray suit was impeccably pressed, and her natural hair was styled in neat professional twists. Her dark eyes swept the room with practiced precision, taking in Susan's designer outfit and perfectly manicured hands with a single glance. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the institutional furniture, highlighting the stark contrast between the two women. The vinyl chair squeaked loudly as Danielle lowered herself into it, maintaining a careful distance from Susan. She placed her leather portfolio on her lap like a shield, her posture straight and defensive. Her fingers tapped once against the worn leather before going still. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and mounting tension. "Mrs. Green," Susan began, her voice carrying a slight tremor despite her attempt at composure. A hint of color rose to her cheeks. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Danielle's response was measured, her tone neutral but guarded. Her shoulders remained squared, ready for battle. "Ms. Green, and I understand this concerns my niece?" The school counselor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a worn cardigan, cleared her throat. "Yes, there seems to be an unusual situation regarding Maya and Mrs. Langford's daughter, Emma." She glanced nervously between the two women. "My niece has only been here 2 days," Danielle said, her words clipped. She crossed her ankles beneath the chair. "I can't imagine what situation could require an emergency meeting." Susan leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening with pressure. "Ms. Green, I saw Maya today. The resemblance between her and my daughter Emma is extraordinary." Her voice caught on the final word. "Many children look similar," Danielle replied flatly, but something flickered across her face. A momentary crack in her composed exterior, a flash of uncertainty quickly buried. Susan took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling visibly. "Perhaps you could tell us a bit about Maya's background? How she came to be in your care?" Danielle was quiet for a long moment, studying Susan's face, weighing her next words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer but still cautious. "My sister Alicia, Maya's mother. She passed away 2 months ago in Detroit. Brain aneurysm. They found her in a motel room." Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her portfolio, the leather creaking under the pressure. "I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 10 years. The air in the room grew heavier, almost suffocating. Susan's face had lost some of its color, her perfect makeup now highlighting her pallor. "Maya came to me after the funeral," Danielle continued. "She had a single suitcase worn down to nothing, one photo of her mother. That's all." She paused, then added deliberately, each word precise and pointed. "No father listed on the birth certificate." Susan's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her purse, pulling out her phone with fumbling fingers. She quickly pulled up a photo of Emma and held it out, the screen's glow illuminating her anxious expression. "This is my daughter." Danielle's carefully maintained expression cracked as she looked at the image. Her breath caught audibly, her eyes widening for just a moment before she quickly recovered, straightening her spine. "I see the resemblance you mentioned." Her voice had lost some of its edge. "Ms. Green," Susan said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is there any possibility that Maya was adopted?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire. Danielle's jaw tightened, and she didn't answer immediately. The defensive wall behind her eyes seemed to grow higher, reinforced by years of protecting herself and now her niece. Susan pressed on, her words coming faster now, tumbling over each other. I think we need to consider a DNA test. The resemblance isn't just similar, they could be identical twins." Her wedding ring caught the light as her hands gestured nervously. Danielle's expression hardened. "A DNA test?" Her tone carried a hint of offense, an edge of historical wariness. "You see a black girl who looks like your daughter and immediately want to test her? That's not—" Susan started, then stopped herself. She took another deep breath, visibly trying to center herself. "I understand how this sounds, but I adopted Emma as an infant. The timing, it could match, and the resemblance is beyond ordinary." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed, each second punctuating the tension. Danielle's gaze remained fixed on Susan, evaluating, measuring, searching for hidden motives. The school counselor sat perfectly still in her chair, as if afraid any movement might shatter the delicate moment between the two mothers. Finally, Danielle spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "If you're right, then we both deserve the truth." She opened her portfolio and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table with one deliberate motion. My contact information? But understand this, I won't have Maya treated like a science experiment. Whatever this is, we handle it with dignity. Her eyes never left Susan's face. Susan nodded quickly, relief visible in the softening of her shoulders. Of course, I can arrange for private testing, expedited results. I'll cover all costs. She reached for the card, her manicured fingertips brushing against the simple, embossed text. I don't need your money, Mrs. Langford, Danielle said sharply, then softened slightly, recognizing the fear mirrored in the other woman's eyes. But for Maya's sake, I'll accept the arrangement. They exchanged necessary details through the school counselor, maintaining a professional distance, both women careful not to reveal too much emotion. When the meeting concluded, Danielle stood first, smoothing her suit jacket with practiced precision, a ritual of composure. We'll be in touch, she said, her tone making it clear the conversation was over for now. Susan watched as Danielle left the office, her heels clicking purposefully against the linoleum floor, each step precise and measured. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt final. Rising on unsteady legs, Susan gathered her belongings. Her designer handbag felt unusually heavy as she made her way out of the building and into the crisp afternoon air. The school grounds were quiet, most students already gone for the day. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, the blue light illuminating her worried face. Finding the number she needed, she pressed dial, her finger hovering for just a moment before committing. Hello? This is Midwest Genetic Testing. A pleasant voice answered on the third ring. Susan's voice was firm despite her internal trembling, her years of maintaining composure in difficult situations serving her now. I need results within the week. The storm arrived without warning, dark clouds rolling across Madison's evening sky like an angry tide. Inside her pristine ensuite bathroom, Susan Langford stood alone, her reflection fractured in the marble-framed mirror. Lightning flashed outside, casting strange shadows across the cream-colored walls. Her hands trembled as she held the crisp white envelope from Madison Private Genetics Lab. The paper felt too heavy, too final. Each crack of thunder made her jump, but she couldn't wait any longer. 6 days of wondering, of lying awake at night, imagining every possible outcome. It all came down to this moment. Susan's perfectly manicured fingers fumbled with the seal. The sound of tearing paper seemed to echo off the bathroom tiles. She pulled out the folded results with unsteady hands, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. The first page was full of scientific terms and charts, but her eyes found what they were looking for immediately. There, in bold black letters, probability of siblingship 99.99%, twin zygosity identical, date of birth matched, hospital of birth matched. The paper slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. Susan's legs gave way, and she slid down against the cool bathroom wall until she was sitting on the heated tile floor. Her chest felt too tight, her throat closing up as the reality crashed over her. Why? She whispered, her voice breaking. Why didn't they tell me? The sobs came then, deep and raw, ripping through her composed exterior. Years of country club smiles and perfect posture crumbled as she hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. The storm outside matched her inner turmoil, rain lashing against the windows in angry sheets. Time seemed to stop as Susan sat there, her mind racing through every moment since Emma's adoption. Every conversation, every document, every reassurance from the agency. It all felt tainted now, twisted by this new truth. The carefully constructed life she'd built for her daughter suddenly felt like a house of cards, vulnerable to collapse with the slightest breath of truth. Finally, when her tears had dried and her breathing steadied, Susan pushed herself up from the floor. Her reflection showed mascara tracks on her cheeks, but she didn't bother to fix them. Instead, she walked purposefully to her home office, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors like a metronome counting down to confrontation. The adoption file was where it had always been, in the bottom drawer of her mahogany desk, filed neatly in a cream-colored folder. Susan pulled it out and laid it on the desk's surface, switching on her brass desk lamp. The warm light illuminated the stack of papers she'd read countless times before, documents she had once trusted completely. With trembling fingers, she uncapped a red marker. Page by page, she began to review the documents she'd once accepted without question. Now, each vague phrase jumped out at her like a red flag. On page 3, sibling status unknown. The marker squeaked as she drew a bright line under the words. Page 7, single birth noted by intake. Another red line. Page 12, no additional family members identified. Line. The more she read, the more her stomach churned. These weren't simple oversights or standard bureaucratic language. The careful vagueness felt deliberate, calculated. Each highlighted phrase seemed to mock her, revealing a pattern she should have seen years ago. How had she missed it? All these years of believing she'd done everything right for Emma, only to discover this fundamental betrayal. Susan's laptop hummed to life as she opened it, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she searched for the adoption agency's current contact information. The website looked different now, modernized, but the agency name remained the same. New Beginnings Family Services. She found herself staring at the staff directory, trying to remember names from 11 years ago. Most were unfamiliar now, but she needed answers. She began copying down email addresses and phone numbers, her handwriting unusually messy in her haste, the pen pressing so hard it nearly tore through the paper. The thunder had grown distant, the storm moving on, but Susan barely noticed. She was too focused on the file in front of her, on the final page where another phrase demanded to be highlighted. No known siblings. She slammed the file shut with enough force to rattle her desk accessories. This wasn't a mistake, she muttered, her voice hard with anger and determination. Someone made this happen. The words hung in the air of her quiet office, a declaration that would change everything. The red marker had left a small stain on her finger, bright as a drop of blood, a fitting symbol of the family bond that had been severed long ago. The morning air bit through Susan's unbuttoned coat as she stood before the brick facade of Madison Adoption and Family Services. The building hadn't changed in 11 years. Same brass lettering, same pristine windows, same carefully tended flower boxes. But today, it felt different. Colder, more fortress than sanctuary. The clouds hung low overhead, mirroring her dark mood. She clutched Emma's adoption file against her chest like a shield. The manila folder was worn at the edges from her endless reading and rereading through the night. Every highlighted line, every vague phrase now felt like a deliberate deception. Her fingers traced the dog-eared corners, evidence of her desperate search for answers. The security guard nodded as she walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The lobby still smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh coffee. A young couple sat holding hands in the waiting area, their faces bright with hope. Susan's stomach twisted. She'd once sat in those same chairs, dreaming of becoming a mother. Their innocent excitement made her heart ache with a strange mixture of envy and pity. Mrs. Langford? The receptionist's voice was professionally pleasant. Director Matthews will see you now. The woman's smile seemed practiced, rehearsed. The director's office was a study in calculated comfort. Soft lighting, gentle colors, carefully chosen artwork of happy families. Behind a massive desk sat Patricia Matthews, her silver hair styled perfectly, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Family photos lined her bookshelf, perfect, pristine, and somehow unsettling. "How can we help you today?" Matthews asked, gesturing to a chair. Susan remained standing. She placed Emma's file on the desk with deliberate care. "I want to know why my daughter's twin sister was hidden from us." Her voice was steadier than she felt inside. Matthew's smile didn't waver. "I've reviewed the file you mentioned in your call. Everything that we were legally obligated to share at the time is documented there." She tapped a manicured fingernail on the desk. "That's not good enough." Susan's voice shook. 2 little girls were separated. 2 sisters were torn apart. Her hands trembled slightly as she pointed to the file. Mrs. Langford, Matthews folded her hands. Adoption cases from that period are sealed. There are policy limitations that protect all parties involved. Her tone was practiced, almost rehearsed, as if she'd given this speech many times before. Protect? Susan's laugh was sharp. You mean protect yourselves. These girls were deliberately separated. I want to know who made that decision and why. Heat rose to her cheeks as anger bubbled inside her. Matthews stood, smoothing her blazer. I understand you're upset, but this case is closed. If you'd like to file a formal inquiry, I can provide you with the necessary forms, though I should warn you the process can take months. Her words were clipped, professional, and utterly devoid of compassion. Months? Susan's hands clenched. My daughter has lost 11 years with her sister. Maya lost her mother 2 months ago, and you want me to wait months for answers? She could hear her voice rising, but couldn't control it. I'm sorry, but I'll have to ask you to leave if you can't maintain a professional tone. Matthews reached for her phone. Should I have security escort you out? Her threat hung in the air between them. Susan grabbed the file and stormed out, her vision blurred with angry tears. In her car, she pulled out her phone and opened the browser. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to retype Madison Adoption and Family Services Staff Directory 3 times. The screen blurred as tears threatened to spill over. The next 2 hours were a blur of calls. Former employees hung up. Others claimed they couldn't remember. Some numbers were disconnected. Susan's voice grew hoarse from repeating her story. Each rejection only strengthened her resolve. On the 7th call, a tired voice answered, Gloria Weems speaking. Please, Susan said, please don't hang up. I'm trying to understand why my daughter's twin was hidden from us during adoption. She held her breath, expecting another dismissal. A long pause followed. What year? 2012. Emma Langford's adoption. Another pause. I'm retired. I can't discuss specific cases. The woman's voice was cautious but not entirely closed off. I'm not asking about specifics, I just need to know, was it common, separating twins? Susan's heart pounded as she waited for an answer. Gloria's sigh crackled through the phone. Off the record? Of course. Susan gripped the phone tighter. The late 2000s, early 2010, there was an unwritten policy, biracial twins especially. Gloria's voice dropped lower. The theory was that each child would develop a stronger sense of identity if placed with families matching one side of their racial background. White families got the lighter twin, black families got the darker one. The words came out with a bitterness that spoke of old wounds. Susan's free hand gripped the steering wheel. How could that be legal? Her knuckles turned white with pressure. It wasn't official policy, nothing in writing, just suggestions, preferences, file notes that somehow went missing, twin studies that never made it to adoptive parents' desks. Gloria's voice grew bitter. An unofficial, unspoken tragedy. Some of us tried to fight it, but, well, I'm retired now, aren't I? The resignation in her tone spoke volumes. Susan's throat felt tight. How many? I don't know. More than there should have been. One would have been too many. Gloria paused. I can't tell you more. I'm sorry. Fear tinged her final words. The line went dead. Susan stared at her phone, then at her laptop screen filled with names and numbers. The truth she'd discovered felt like a physical weight crushing her chest. Each breath became more difficult than the last. She slammed the laptop closed, tears finally spilling over. They stole a sister, she whispered into the empty car. The words hung in the air, a terrible truth that could never be undone. Susan's fingers trembled as she dialed Danielle's number. The storm had cleared, but dark clouds still hung low over Madison, matching her mood. She sat in her home office, surrounded by the scattered papers of Emma's adoption file, each highlighted section a reminder of what had been hidden. Yellow sticky notes marked the most damning parts, places where information should have been disclosed but wasn't. The phone rang 3 times before Danielle answered, her voice cautious and distant through the speakerphone. "Hello, Susan?" "Thank you for taking my call," Susan said, working to keep her voice steady. "I received the DNA results today." She glanced at the envelope on her desk, its contents now burned into her memory. The silence on the other end stretched out, filled only by the soft sound of Danielle's breathing. Susan could almost picture her sitting straight-backed, bracing herself for what came next, perhaps gripping the phone a little too tightly. "They're identical twins," Susan continued softly. "The match is 99.99%. Her throat tightened around the words. She heard Danielle exhale slowly. "I see." Those 2 simple words carried the weight of years. I think we need to talk about this. All of us." Susan's voice cracked slightly. "The girls deserve to know." She ran her fingers through her hair, a nervous habit she thought she'd outgrown. After what felt like an eternity, Danielle spoke. "Tomorrow afternoon, somewhere public." Her tone left no room for negotiation. They agreed to meet at the Garden Cafe, a quiet spot on the edge of town known for its private booths and discreet service, a place where difficult conversations could happen without prying eyes. The next day, Susan helped Emma choose her outfit, a navy dress with pearl buttons that usually gave her confidence. But now Emma's hands wouldn't stop fidgeting with her silver charm bracelet, twisting it round and round her wrist until the skin beneath it reddened. "What if she doesn't like me?" Emma whispered as they pulled into the parking lot, her voice small and uncertain. Susan squeezed her daughter's hand. "Just be yourself, sweetheart. That's all anyone can ask." The advice felt hollow, even as she said it. They entered the cafe first, choosing a corner booth with plenty of space. Emma sat perfectly straight, her legs crossed at the ankles just as she'd been taught, but her fingers kept working at the bracelet, betraying her nervousness. When Danielle and Maya walked in, the air seemed to shift. Maya wore a gray hoodie despite the warm afternoon, the hood pulled up to partially shield her face. Her posture was a stark contrast to Emma's, shoulders hunched, hands buried in her pockets as if trying to disappear into herself. The moment the girls saw each other, everything else faded away. It was like watching a mirror come to life. They had the same slight tilt to their heads, the same way of blinking rapidly when surprised. Even their breathing fell into sync, nature overriding 11 years of separation. Emma's face lit up with a tentative smile. "Hi, Maya." Hope sparkled in her eyes. Maya's expression remained carefully blank. She slid into the booth next to Danielle without responding, her body angled slightly away from the table. "Would anyone like something to eat?" Susan offered, trying to break the tension. "They make wonderful chocolate croissants here." She gestured toward the display case filled with pastries. "I'm good," Maya muttered, her first words since arriving. She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. Emma's smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "I love their hot chocolate. Maybe we could share one?" Her voice lifted at the end, hopeful. Maya just shrugged, staring down at the table, tracing invisible patterns with her fingertip. Susan ordered a variety of pastries anyway, arranging them on delicate plates when they arrived. Emma carefully broke her croissant into small, neat pieces. Maya didn't touch the food, though her eyes occasionally darted toward it. "We're in the same math class," Emma tried again. "Mrs. Peterson seems nice." "Whatever." Maya's voice was barely above a whisper, but the edge in it was unmistakable. The silence grew heavy. Susan and Danielle exchanged glances. Danielle's expression remained unreadable, but her hands were clasped tightly together on the table, knuckles white with tension. Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and colorful. "I made this for you," she said, holding out a carefully woven friendship bracelet in shades of purple and blue. "I thought maybe you'd like it?" The bracelet dangled between them, a bridge Emma was trying to build. Maya didn't move to take it. The bracelet dangled between them, swaying slightly in the air conditioning, a physical manifestation of the gap between them. After several uncomfortable minutes, Danielle checked her watch. "We should get going, Maya. You have homework to finish." Relief flickered across Maya's face at the escape route. They stood to leave, Maya pushing herself up without looking at anyone. As they reached the door, she turned back toward Danielle and muttered, "She smells like lavender." Mom hated lavender. The words were quiet but carried across the cafe like a thunderclap. Danielle's composed expression cracked for just a moment, her eyes widening in surprise. Something raw and unguarded flashed across her face before she collected herself and guided Maya outside. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the granite countertops. Emma burst into the kitchen, her curls bouncing with each excited step. In her hands, she clutched a brand new spiral notebook, its cover decorated with careful block letters spelling out "Twin Things." She'd spent half the night working on it, the pages already filled with colorful doodles and lists. Susan looked up from her coffee, her heart catching at the sight of her daughter's enthusiasm. Half of her wanted to smile, to share in Emma's joy. The other half remembered Maya's cold stare at the cafe yesterday, and worry gnawed at her stomach. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, trying to hide her concern. "Mom, look!" Emma plopped onto a kitchen stool, flipping open her notebook. "I made a list of everything Maya and I can do together." Her pencil tapped against the paper as she read aloud. "We can get matching pajamas, the cute ones from Target with the stars on them. And we need to make up our own secret handshake, like the twins in that movie we watched." Her words tumbled out faster than her breath could keep up. Susan set her coffee mug down gently. "That sounds nice, sweetheart." She tried to keep her voice light, even as her chest tightened with worry. "Oh, and for our birthday, we could make cupcakes together. Do you think Maya likes chocolate or vanilla better?" Emma's eyes sparkled as she scribbled more ideas. "Maybe both. We could do marble cupcakes with sprinkles and those little silver balls that hurt your teeth but look so pretty." "Emma," Susan said softly, reaching across the counter to touch her daughter's hand. "I know you're excited, but we need to take things slowly. Maya might need time to adjust." She squeezed Emma's fingers gently, trying to soften the caution in her words. Across town, in a modest apartment complex, Danielle stood in her small kitchen, watching Maya push cereal around in her bowl. Morning light filtered through worn curtains, casting shadows on the linoleum floor that needed replacing years ago. The fridge hummed loudly in the background. "Maya," Danielle said, her voice firm but gentle, "I need you to hear me on this. Don't let yourself fall into someone else's fantasy." She leaned against the counter, arms crossed protectively over her chest. Maya's spoon clinked against the bowl. "I'm not." Her voice was flat, her eyes fixed on the soggy cereal. "That girl, Emma, she's had a very different life than you. Different opportunities, different—" Danielle paused, choosing her words carefully. "Different experiences." The weight of everything unsaid hung between them like a curtain. Maya shrugged, standing up from the table. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out the friendship bracelet Emma had given her at the cafe. Without a word, she dropped it into the kitchen trash can. Danielle watched, her face carefully neutral but said nothing. The colorful threads disappeared beneath yesterday's junk mail. Later that afternoon, Susan's phone buzzed with a text message. She'd been trying to focus on work, but found herself checking her phone every few minutes, her attention scattered like leaves in the wind. "How is Maya doing today?" she'd written to Danielle. The response came back short and clipped. "She's fine." Just 2 words that revealed nothing. Susan's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed and deleted several responses before finally sending, "Emma would like to send Maya a card. Would that be okay?" She held her breath after hitting send. Minutes ticked by before Danielle replied, "That's fine, but don't expect much." Susan sighed, setting her phone down on her desk with a soft thud. In her room, Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by craft supplies. She'd picked flowers from the garden last week and pressed them between the pages of her heaviest books. Now she carefully arranged them on thick cardstock, adding touches of glitter glue around the edges. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated, determined to make it perfect. "Dear Maya," she wrote in her neatest handwriting, "I'm so happy I found you. I always felt like something was missing, and now I know what it was. You're my sister, and I hope we can be best friends too." She dotted the I's with tiny hearts. She decorated the envelope with small hearts and stars, then ran downstairs to find Susan. "Mom, can we drive over to Maya's? Please?" Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with hope. Susan hesitated, but the hope in Emma's eyes made it impossible to refuse. 20 minutes later, they pulled up outside Danielle's apartment building. Emma clutched the envelope to her chest as they walked to the door, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Danielle answered after the second knock, her expression guarded. She looked at the envelope in Emma's hands, then at Susan standing behind her. For a moment, she seemed to wage an internal battle before calling over her shoulder, "Maya, can you come here?" Her voice echoed down the narrow hallway. Maya appeared in the hallway wearing the same hoodie from yesterday. Her face was blank as she looked at Emma, who held out the card with trembling hands. A wall of invisible bricks seemed to stand between them. "I made this for you," Emma said softly. "The flowers are from my garden." Her smile wavered, but held. Maya took the envelope. Without opening it, without even looking at the careful decorations, she turned and dropped it directly into the trash can beside the door. The sound of it hitting the bottom seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her outstretched hand still hanging in the air. Her lower lip trembled as she watched Maya turn and walk away without a word, disappearing back into the apartment. The rejection was a physical thing, sharp and cold against her skin. The autumn sun cast long shadows through the Langford's bay windows as Susan adjusted the sterling silver place settings for the fourth time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she straightened each fork to perfect alignment. The formal dining room gleamed with polish and preparation. Crystal water glasses caught the light, white linen napkins sat folded in precise triangles, and the mahogany table reflected her anxious expression like a mirror. She'd spent the entire morning cleaning, polishing, and preparing, determined to make everything perfect. "Mom, is the fancy china really necessary?" Emma asked, hovering nearby in her Sunday best, a powder blue dress with a white cardigan. "Maybe it's too much?" Her eyes followed her mother's nervous movements, concern etched across her young face. Susan smoothed an invisible wrinkle from the tablecloth. "We want Maya to feel special, sweetheart. This is her first real visit with us." She adjusted a flower in the centerpiece, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. At precisely 3 p.m., the doorbell chimed. Susan's back straightened as she walked to answer it, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors like a metronome counting down the moments. Danielle stood on the porch, one hand firmly on Maya's shoulder. Maya wore ripped jeans and a worn hoodie, a stark contrast to Emma's careful outfit. Her expression was guarded, eyes wary. 3 hours, Danielle said firmly. "I'll be back at 6. She squeezed Maya's shoulder once before turning away, leaving her niece standing stiffly in the doorway. The sound of her car engine faded down the street. Maya stepped inside like she was entering a museum, her sneakers leaving slight scuff marks on the pristine floor. Her eyes darted from the abstract paintings on the walls to the crystal vase filled with fresh flowers, taking in every detail of the Langfords' carefully curated home. She seemed to be cataloging everything, measuring the differences between this world and her own. "Welcome, Maya," Susan said warmly, gesturing toward the living room. "Would you like a tour?" Her smile stretched a little too wide, her voice a little too bright. Maya shrugged, trailing her fingers along the white leather couch as she passed it. She paused at the baby grand piano, lifting the cover to press one key. The note hung in the air, discordant and lonely, echoing through the perfect silence of the house. Emma bounced on her toes nearby, clearly trying to contain her excitement. "Want to see my room? I have some games we could play, or..." Her words tumbled out in a rush of hope and nervousness. "Later, Emma," Susan interrupted gently. "Dinner's ready now. I made pot roast. I hope you like pot roast, Maya." She gestured toward the dining room, where steam rose from the serving dishes. Another shrug was the only response. They moved toward the dining room, where the table settings gleamed under the crystal chandelier. Susan gestured to the chair beside Emma's usual spot, but Maya ignored it. Instead, she took her plate and silverware and sat cross-legged on the floor near the window, her back against the wall. The silence that followed was deafening. Susan's carefully planned dinner conversation starters died in her throat as she watched Maya pick at her food with the wrong fork. Emma hesitated only a moment before grabbing her own plate and joining Maya on the floor, her blue dress pooling around her like spilled water. "Emma, honey, we don't eat on the floor," Susan started, but stopped when she saw the girls sitting mirror image to each other, both with their backs against the wall. Something in the sight made her words catch in her throat. "It's okay, Mom," Emma said quietly. "The view's actually really nice from down here." She smiled tentatively at Maya, who kept her eyes fixed on her plate. Susan forced herself to continue eating at the empty table, her knife scraping against fine china, the only sound in the room. After dinner, she brightened artificially. "I have something for you, Maya." She tried to inject enthusiasm into her voice. She retrieved a large shopping bag from the hall closet, the Burberry logo prominent on its side. "I noticed you didn't have a proper winter coat, and the weather's turning cold." Her words trailed off as Maya's expression remained unchanged. Maya accepted the bag with blank eyes. She unzipped it slowly, revealing the camel-colored wool coat with its distinctive check lining. A small M was monogrammed on the breast pocket. Without a word, Maya dropped the coat back into its bag and pushed it across the floor toward Susan, the soft scrape of the bag against hardwood filling the room. "You don't like it?" Susan asked, her voice tight. "We can exchange it for a different color." She reached for the bag, her fingers clutching the expensive paper. "Emma," Maya spoke for the first time, her voice flat. "Do you have that coat too?" Emma shifted uncomfortably. Yes, but in navy blue?" She twisted a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit she'd had since kindergarten. "Then I definitely don't want it." Maya's words fell like stones in still water. Emma jumped up suddenly, her face flushed. "Wait here. I have something else." She ran upstairs, returning moments later with a well-worn coloring book. "Remember this? We used to love it in first grade. Mrs. Peterson would let us color during quiet time and—" her words tumbled out breathlessly, her eyes bright with hope. Maya's expression didn't change as she stared at the book. "That wasn't me." "But it was. You always picked the purple crayon first and—" Emma clutched the book tighter, as if it contained proof of their shared past. "That wasn't me," Maya repeated, louder this time. "That was you, with your perfect clothes and your perfect house and your perfect mom who buys matching coats." She stood up abruptly. "I'm going to the bathroom." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. She disappeared down the hall, leaving Emma clutching the coloring book, her lower lip trembling slightly. Susan reached for her daughter, but Emma pulled away, hugging the book to her chest like a shield against disappointment. The rest of the visit passed in painful increments. Maya wandered the house like a ghost, touching nothing, saying nothing. When Danielle's car pulled up at 6, Maya was already waiting by the door, her posture tense with the need to escape. After they left, Susan stood in the kitchen staring at the untouched chocolate mousse she'd made for dessert. The fancy dishes were piled in the sink, a reminder of her failed attempts at perfection. Emma leaned against the counter, still holding the coloring book, her eyes red-rimmed. "It'll get better," Susan whispered, reaching out to smooth Emma's curls. "She's just scared." She tried to believe her own words. Emma said nothing, but her grip on the coloring book tightened until her knuckles turned white. The second Sunday visit arrived with golden autumn light streaming through the Langfords' windows. Emma sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, carefully adding one final sticker to the scrapbook's cover. The book was thick with memories, its pages bulging with photos and ticket stubs and carefully written captions. She'd spent every evening that week hunched over it, cutting and pasting, writing and decorating until her fingers ached. "Do you think she'll like it?" Emma asked, looking up at Susan, who stood in the doorway. Her voice trembled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Susan smiled, though her eyes held a hint of worry. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. You put so much love into it." She didn't add the doubts that nagged at her, that perhaps this wasn't the right approach. The doorbell chimed exactly at 3 o'clock. Maya stood on the porch, hands stuffed in her hoodie pockets, shoulders hunched against the crisp fall air, while Danielle gave brief, polite nods to Susan. The tension between the two women hung like an invisible wall. "I'll be back at 6, Danielle said, her tone clipped. She squeezed Maya's shoulder before walking back to her car, casting one last protective glance over her shoulder. The house felt different today, quieter, more tentative. Even the usual clicks of Susan's heels on the hardwood seemed muted as she led Maya inside. The air felt charged with unspoken emotions. "Come on," Emma said, brightening. "I want to show you something upstairs." She reached for Maya's hand but stopped herself, letting her arm fall awkwardly to her side. The small rejection stung, but she pushed forward with determined cheerfulness. Maya followed Emma to the sunroom, where afternoon light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. Plush chairs faced a view of the manicured backyard, and potted plants created soft shadows on the walls. Everything was perfectly arranged, perfectly peaceful. Emma settled onto a cushioned window seat, patting the space beside her. Maya remained standing, her posture stiff and guarded. "I made this for you," Emma said, lifting the scrapbook. The cover read, "What You Missed," in careful silver lettering, decorated with butterfly stickers and pressed flowers. "So you can see everything that happened before we found each other." Her voice was filled with innocent pride. Maya's expression didn't change as she took the book, but her fingers tightened slightly on its edges. Something flickered behind her eyes, a storm gathering. The first page showed Emma's 6th birthday party. She wore a pink tulle dress, blowing out candles on a 3-tiered cake while Susan beamed beside her. Emma's caption read, "My princess party." "I wished for a sister that day but didn't know I already had one." The words, written in glittery pen, seemed to mock the reality of their separation. Maya turned the pages slowly. There were photos from dance recitals, Emma in a sparkly costume executing a perfect arabesque. Beach photos from Cape Cod showed her building sandcastles with Susan, both wearing matching sun hats. Christmas morning in Aspen captured Emma opening presents in front of a massive fireplace, snow visible through picture windows behind her. Each image displayed a life of privilege and ease. Emma pointed eagerly at different pictures. "That's when I won the spelling bee in 3rd grade. And there's my first piano recital. I was so nervous. Oh, and that's from our trip to Disney World last year." Her voice bubbled with excitement, oblivious to the darkening storm in Maya's eyes. Maya's face had grown darker with each turn of the page, her jaw clenched tight, a muscle twitching in her cheek. Without warning, she grabbed the first section of pages and ripped them out with a sharp, violent motion. The sound of tearing paper filled the quiet room like a scream. "None of this is mine," she said, her voice low and hard. The torn pages fluttered to the floor like wounded birds, landing in a scattered mess of smiling faces and happy memories. Emma's face crumpled. She stared at the destroyed photos, at her careful captions now ripped and scattered. Tears welled in her eyes, and she ran from the room, her sobs echoing down the hallway. The sound of her heartbreak hung in the air. Susan's footsteps thundered up the stairs. What happened? Emma. She appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene, the torn pages, Maya's stony expression, the mutilated scrapbook. Her face shifted from concern to anger in an instant. Maya was already walking past her, heading downstairs to wait by the front door. She stood there, rigid and silent, until Danielle arrived early after receiving Susan's tense text. The ride home was filled with heavy silence. Later that night, Susan paced her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. "This behavior is completely unacceptable," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Emma spent weeks on that scrapbook. Maya needs to apologize." Her free hand clenched and unclenched at her side. "Apologize?" Danielle's voice crackled through the speaker. "For what? Not wanting to pretend her whole life started the day she walked into your perfect house? That's not what this was about." "That's exactly what it was about," Danielle cut in. "You can't just erase 11 years of her life with some pretty pictures and fancy captions. While Emma was having princess parties, Maya was sleeping in motel rooms. While Emma was in dance class, Maya was watching her mother work 3 jobs. You don't get to overwrite her past just because it makes you uncomfortable." Each word landed like a blow. We're trying to include her in our family. By showing her everything she never had? Everything that was taken from her? Danielle's voice rose. That's not inclusion. That's erasure. The call ended abruptly. Susan stood in her silent kitchen, hands shaking. The truth of Danielle's words echoed in the empty space around her. Across town, Danielle sat on the edge of Maya's bed. The girl was curled under her blanket, only her dark curls visible on the pillow. Danielle stroked her hair gently, her touch a silent promise of protection. "You owe no one your forgiveness," she said softly. Maya pulled the blanket tighter over her head, but Danielle caught the slight tremor in her shoulders as she cried silently in the darkness. Her tears were for a past that could never be reclaimed and a future that seemed impossible to imagine. The next morning's autumn sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows as Susan sat at her marble counter, fingers hovering over her laptop keyboard. Her coffee had grown cold, forgotten, as she scrolled through search results. The screen reflected in her reading glasses as she typed, "Prestigious etiquette classes for Girls Madison." Her perfectly manicured nails tapped nervously against the granite surface as she waited for the pages to load. The Madison Country Club's website appeared, featuring photos of young ladies in perfect posture, learning the intricate dance of proper society. Girls in matching pastel dresses sat with ankles crossed, backs straight as rulers, practicing the delicate art of afternoon tea. Susan clicked through the images, a small smile forming on her lips. The 6-week Young Ladies of Grace workshop promised everything from table manners to proper conversation skills, with special emphasis on social poise and deportment. The price tag made her wince, but she barely hesitated before entering her credit card information. "Perfect," she whispered, registering both Emma and Maya. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she composed an email to Danielle, carefully choosing each word to sound enthusiastic rather than presumptuous. "I've found a wonderful opportunity for the girls to bond. The Madison Country Club is offering an exclusive etiquette workshop. Everything is arranged. All Maya needs to do is show up on Saturday at 10 a.m. Emma is so excited to share this experience with her sister. I just know they'll both benefit from this amazing program." She hit send before doubt could creep in, closing her laptop with a decisive click. Miles away in her office cubicle, Danielle's phone buzzed with the email notification. Her lunch break had just started, and she nearly choked on her turkey sandwich as she read Susan's message. Her fingers tightened around the phone, knuckles whitening as she read and reread the presumptuous words. After several deep breaths that did little to calm her rising anger, she called Maya. "Baby girl?" Danielle said, her voice carefully controlled despite the tension evident in every syllable. "Susan signed you up for some fancy etiquette classes with Emma." "She what?" Maya's voice crackled through the phone, thick with disbelief and growing defiance. "Go ahead and go," Danielle said, a hint of steel in her tone, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Let her see what happens when she tries to remake you in her image. Show her exactly who you are." Saturday morning arrived crisp and bright, with just enough autumn chill to require light jackets. Susan's Mercedes pulled into the country club's circular drive, tires crunching softly on the perfectly maintained gravel. Emma sat primly in the passenger seat in her powder blue cardigan and pearl hair clips, every inch the proper young lady. Her ballet flats matched her sweater perfectly, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap. They waited by the grand entrance, Susan checking her watch every few minutes, her heel tapping an impatient rhythm on the concrete. At exactly 9:55 a.m., Danielle's car appeared. Maya emerged like a storm cloud in a sea of pastels, a deliberate contradiction to everything the country club represented. Her combat boots clunked against the marble steps, black laces untied and trailing. Ripped fishnet tights disappeared under a frayed denim skirt, topped with a worn leather jacket covered in safety pins and band patches. Her curls were wild and free, a direct contrast to Emma's carefully styled ones, and dark lipstick completed her rebellion. Susan's practiced smile froze on her face, her eyes widening slightly in dismay. "Maya, how nice to see you." Maya's answering smirk was sharp enough to cut glass, her eyes gleaming with challenge. The etiquette instructor, Mrs. Pembroke, was a tall woman with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun, her pearl necklace gleaming against her pressed silk blouse. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she surveyed her students, 12 girls from Madison's most prominent families. Her gaze lingered disapprovingly on Maya's outfit, her thin lips pressing into an even thinner line. "Today we begin with the fundamentals of ladylike posture," Mrs. Pembroke announced, demonstrating by perching on a chair with ruler straight spine, hands folded precisely in her lap. "A proper young lady never slouches." Maya sprawled deeper into her seat, boots propped on the chair in front of her, the metal buckles scratching against the expensive upholstery. "Miss Green," Mrs. Pembroke's voice dripped with barely concealed disdain, each syllable sharp as ice. "Perhaps you'd care to demonstrate what not to do for the class?" The room went silent, the other girls shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Emma's eyes widened in horror, her cheeks flushing pink with second-hand embarrassment. Maya stood slowly, deliberately, the legs of her chair scraping against the polished floor. For a moment, it seemed she might comply. Instead, she grabbed her chair and flipped it with a crash that echoed through the elegant room, the sound as jarring as a gunshot in a library. Without a word, she stormed out, combat boots thundering down the hallway, leaving chaos in her wake. Susan sat frozen in her observer's chair, face burning with embarrassment as whispers filled the room. Emma looked close to tears, her perfect posture crumpling as she stared at the overturned chair. That evening, Susan was loading the dishwasher, mechanically arranging plates as she replayed the morning's disaster in her mind, when aggressive knocking rattled her front door. She opened it to find Danielle on her doorstep, practically vibrating with fury. Her designer blazer couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders, and her eyes blazed with barely contained rage, her professional facade cracking under the weight of her anger. "She is not your project," Danielle spat through clenched teeth, each word precise and cutting, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's not some charity case for you to fix." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation and hurt, marking the growing chasm between two mothers trying to protect the same child in vastly different ways. The autumn wind whistled through the gap between them, carrying away any chance of easy understanding. The tension crackled in the Langfords' pristine foyer like static before a storm. Susan stood with her arms crossed, designer heels planted firmly on the marble floor, while Danielle's tall frame blocked the doorway, her shadow stretching across the threshold. The chandelier's crystal drops caught the evening light, casting dancing patterns on the walls that belied the heaviness of the moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the ornate windows as if nature itself sensed the brewing conflict. From their perch on the curved staircase, Emma and Maya watched the confrontation unfold. Emma hugged her knees to her chest, her perfectly pressed uniform skirt wrinkled from sitting. Maya lounged against the banister, affecting indifference, but her fingers drummed restlessly against the polished wood. The sisters didn't touch, separated by inches that might as well have been miles. "I'm trying to give her something you can't." Susan's voice rang out sharp and defensive. Her perfectly styled hair was coming loose around her temples, her usual composure cracking. A vein pulsed at her throat, betraying the control she fought to maintain. Danielle's laugh was bitter and cold. "You mean control? She's not a porcelain doll you get to dress up and show off." She took a step forward, her heel clicking against the marble. "Those etiquette classes? That expensive coat? That's not about Maya. That's about making her fit your world." Her words hung in the air, heavy with years of resentment. "At least I'm thinking about her future," Susan shot back, color rising in her cheeks. "What are you doing for her emotional needs? Letting her act out? Encouraging this rebellion?" She gestured wildly, her manicured hands slicing through the air. "Emotional needs?" Danielle's voice rose dangerously. "Where were you for the last decade? Where were you when she was learning to walk, talk, survive?" She jabbed a finger toward Susan. "You had your perfect little life with Emma while Maya bounced between motels with my sister. Now you want to sweep in and play savior?" Each word landed like a physical blow. "That's not fair." Susan's composure shattered completely. "We didn't know. The agency dash dash. Life isn't fair. Danielle cut her off. But you wouldn't know about that, would you? Living in your bubble, thinking you can fix everything with money and manners? Her eyes blazed with a fire born from years of watching systems fail people like her. On the stairs, Emma's shoulders began to shake. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. Maya glanced at her sister, something flickering across her face before she locked it away behind her usual mask of indifference. For just a moment, her fingers twitched toward Emma before curling back into a fist. Maya needs structure, Susan insisted, her voice trembling. She needs opportunities. She needs to be herself. Danielle's words echoed off the high ceiling. Not some carbon copy of Emma. Not some project for you to remake in your image. The family photos lining the wall seemed to bear silent witness, their perfect smiles now feeling like an accusation. I'm trying to help. Help? Danielle's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Like those white women who helped by separating them in the first place? By deciding which twin deserved which life? Her chest heaved with each breath, decades of injustice fueling her rage. Susan recoiled as if she'd been slapped. That's not… I would never… But you are, Danielle pressed. Every time you try to erase who she is, every time you push your values, your lifestyle, your expectations, you're doing exactly what they did, deciding what's best for her without asking what she wants. Her voice dropped lower, more dangerous in its quietness. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's quiet sobs were the only sound in the massive foyer. Maya sat perfectly still, her face unreadable, but her knuckles were white where they gripped the banister. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked relentlessly, marking each painful second. Susan's voice came out barely above a whisper. I just want to make things right. You can't. Danielle's words were final, heavy with the weight of truth. You can't undo the past decade. You can't buy her love with fancy clothes and finishing schools. You can't fix this by forcing her to be someone she's not. Her shoulders slumped slightly, exhaustion creeping in beneath the anger. She turned to the stairs, her eyes finding Maya. Let's go. Emma suddenly stood up, her voice cracking with desperation. Please don't. The words hung in the air, raw and pleading. Her hand reached out, trembling in the space between them. Maya rose slowly, deliberately avoiding Emma's tear-stained face. She descended the stairs with measured steps, combat boots loud against the wooden treads. She passed between the two women without acknowledging either of them, heading straight for the door. The sleeve of her worn jacket brushed against Susan's arm, the briefest of contacts. Danielle followed, pausing only briefly in the doorway. The gift bag Susan had prepared sat untouched by the door, its tissue paper wilting in the evening air. Without another word, Danielle pulled the door closed behind them. The slam echoed through the house like a gunshot. Emma's footsteps pounded up the stairs, followed by the distant sound of her bedroom door closing. Susan remained frozen in the foyer, her breathing ragged, surrounded by the perfect emptiness of her beautiful home. The chandelier continued to cast its dancing lights on the walls, now seeming more like shadows than stars. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the granite countertops. Susan stood at the stove, mechanically flipping blueberry pancakes. Emma's favorite since she was little. The familiar scent of butter and vanilla usually brought Emma running downstairs, her eyes bright with anticipation. But today, the house remained eerily quiet, hollow somehow. The silence felt unnatural, like something precious had been removed from the home. Susan arranged the pancakes in a perfect stack, adding a light dusting of powdered sugar and a fresh strawberry on top. She traced her finger along the edge of the plate, making sure everything looked just right. She glanced at the empty kitchen doorway, then at the clock. 8:15 a.m. Emma should have been down by now, chattering about her dreams or plans for the day, filling the kitchen with her bubbly energy. Emma? Susan called up the stairs, forcing cheer into her voice that she didn't feel. Breakfast is ready, sweetheart. They're getting cold. I made them just how you like them. No response, not even the creak of a floorboard. The silence pressed against her ears. Susan climbed the stairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a metronome counting the seconds of silence. Each step felt heavier than the last. She found Emma's door closed, unusual for her typically sunny daughter who preferred the openness of her space, who loved letting light flood every corner. She knocked softly, heart tightening in her chest. "I'm not hungry," came the muffled reply, the voice barely recognizable as her daughter's. It sounded flat, drained of its usual warmth. "You need to eat something," Susan said, trying to keep her voice light, though worry crept in at the edges. Her fingers worried at a loose thread on her sleeve. "I made your favorite, with extra blueberries, the way you've always liked them." "I said I'm not hungry." The words came out sharper this time, edged with something Susan couldn't quite name. Susan pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the door, feeling the barrier between them more acutely than ever. The physical door was just a symbol of the emotional wall that had sprung up overnight. "Do you want to talk about what happened? About Maya?" She held her breath, waiting. "No." The single word felt like a wall between them, brick and mortar, and years of unspoken truths. Susan stood there for a moment longer, hand hovering near the doorknob, fingers trembling slightly, then retreated downstairs. The perfect stack of pancakes grew cold on the counter, the melting butter pooling sadly around the edges like tears. She stared at the plate, wondering how something so simple, so routine, could suddenly feel so meaningless. Across town, in their modest apartment with its worn carpet and faded curtains, Danielle and Maya moved through their morning routine in similar silence. The only sounds were the quiet clink of cereal bowls and the hum of the refrigerator, a soundtrack to their shared isolation. Sunlight struggled through the thin curtains, casting muted shadows across the small kitchen table. Danielle watched Maya push her Cheerios around the bowl, not eating, just creating soggy little islands in the milk. The circles floated and sank, ignored. "Maya," she said finally, her voice firm but tired, dark circles under her eyes betraying her sleepless night. "Give me your phone." Maya looked up, her expression guarded, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Her fingers tightened around her spoon. "Delete Emma's number," Danielle said firmly, extending her hand, palm up, demanding. "It's better this way. Trust me on this. That family, .. She let the sentence hang, unfinished. Maya nodded once, took out her phone, and appeared to comply, thumb moving over the screen. But her thumb hovered over the delete button, never pressing it, preserving the fragile connection. Danielle didn't check, turning away to rinse her coffee mug, the water running perhaps longer than necessary. The days crawled by. 1 week passed like molasses in January. No calls, no texts, no visits. The silence between the families grew deeper, harder to break, becoming its own living thing. It breathed in the spaces where laughter should have been, expanding to fill every corner of both homes. In her room, Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by colored pencils and sketch paper. Her fingers moved quickly across the page, creating bold lines and bright colors, pouring her feelings into art when words failed her. Panel by panel, a story emerged. 2 identical superheroes, separated by a shadowy figure in a business suit. She labeled him the System in jagged letters, giving shape to the nameless force that had kept her from her sister. She pressed her pencil down hard, nearly tearing the paper with her intensity. In one panel, the heroes reached for each other across a great divide, fingertips almost touching, their faces mirror images of longing. In another, they fought side by side against the villain, stronger together than apart, capes flowing behind them like victory flags. Emma drew for hours, filling page after page with her hopes and fears, but never showed anyone. When Susan asked what she was working on, Emma quickly covered the drawings with her arm. Nothing. Just another secret to keep, another piece of herself to hide away. Meanwhile, Maya lay in her bed each night, waiting until Danielle's footsteps retreated to the living room and the television hummed to life. Only then would she reach under her pillow and pull out a creased Polaroid photo of Emma. She'd taken it secretly during one of their visits when Emma wasn't looking, a stolen moment of connection. In the picture, Emma sat at the piano, sunlight catching her curls, making them glow like a halo around her face, her expression peaceful, unguarded. Maya traced her finger over the image, studying the face that matched her own. The same eyes, the same nose, the same smile she rarely showed. Sometimes she'd hold the photo up to her mirror, creating a triple reflection. Herself, the photo, and her reflection, all the same face. The image multiplied but never filled the emptiness she felt. But she never spoke about it, never mentioned Emma's name, keeping her sister locked safely in her heart, afraid that speaking the name would somehow make the loss more real. The days felt heavier, weighted with unspoken words. Susan tried to engage Emma at dinner, asking about school, about her friends, about anything that might crack the shell her daughter had built around herself. Emma gave short, cold answers between pushing food around her plate, building walls with each syllable, her fork scraping patterns into her mashed potatoes. Mrs. Martinez said my science project was good. That's wonderful, honey. What was the project about? Susan leaned forward, eager for this small opening, her eyes hopeful. Stuff? What kind of stuff? Susan pressed gently, trying to keep the conversation alive. Just stuff, Mom. Can I be excused? Emma's chair scraped against the floor, a harsh punctuation to the failed conversation. Susan would watch her daughter retreat upstairs, the distance between them growing with each step, wondering how to bridge a gap she couldn't even name. The sound of Emma's door closing echoed through the house like a judgment. At night, Emma sat alone in her room, the scrapbook she'd made for Maya lying untouched on her desk. The torn pages had been carefully smoothed out and placed back in, but the tape holding them was visible, like scars on the paper, permanent reminders of rejection. She stared at the photos of her birthdays, her dance recitals, her family vacations, all the memories Maya had rejected, all the happiness that now felt somehow false, tainted by what she now knew about her sister's life. Across town, Maya lay in her darkened room, the hidden Polaroid clutched in her hand like a talisman against loneliness. The sisters, separated by miles and silence, both felt the weight of what was lost, what was never really had. In different rooms, in different homes, their whispers echoed each other in the darkness, unknowingly connected by the same ache. Sister, Emma breathed, touching the scrapbook's cover, the word a wish, a prayer, a hope for tomorrow. Sister, Maya whispered to the photo before tucking it away again. The word, a secret, a treasure, a promise. The word hung in the air like a prayer, unheard by anyone else, as both girls drifted off to sleep, each dreaming of the other, of hands reaching across impossible distances, fingers almost touching, almost connecting, almost whole. The bustling auditorium of St. Agnes Academy hummed with nervous energy. Students in pressed uniforms clutched note cards and shuffled papers, their voices a mix of whispers and last-minute practice runs. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced above the polished wooden floors. Emma stood in front of the assignment board, her navy blazer crisp and perfect, her curls pulled back into a neat ponytail. Her finger traced down the list of names until it stopped suddenly, her breath catching in her throat. There, printed in clear black letters, Team 7, Emma Langford and Maya Green. Her stomach twisted into knots. 4 weeks. It had been 4 weeks since she'd heard Maya's voice, since that terrible night when everything fell apart. She gripped her note cards tighter, the edges crumpling slightly. Across the lobby, Maya emerged from the crowd wearing the school uniform, but with her own touches, a slightly loosened tie, her blazer adorned with small enamel pins. Her eyes found the board, scanned down, and froze. The same realization hit her, and her usual mask of indifference flickered for just a moment. Neither girl moved. They stood like statues on opposite sides of the lobby, other students flowing around them like water around rocks. In the auditorium, Susan sat near the front, her leather portfolio balanced on her lap as she reviewed the program. Her hair was perfectly styled, her outfit carefully chosen, every inch the supportive mother. She hadn't seen Danielle since that night, and the memory still made her shoulders tense. Several rows back, Danielle sat alone, her legs crossed at the ankle, one heel tapping silently against the floor. She'd taken the afternoon off work to be here, her laptop bag tucked under her seat. Her eyes scanned the room periodically, careful to avoid looking in Susan's direction. Neither woman knew what was about to unfold on stage. The debate coordinator, Mrs. Peterson, moved through the lobby with clipboard in hand. "Team 7, she called out, looking around. "Team 7, please report to the prep room." Emma's feet felt like lead as she made her way across the lobby. Maya approached from the other direction, her steps measured and deliberate. They reached the prep room door at the same moment, both hesitating before Maya reached for the handle first. The small room was quiet except for the soft whir of an air conditioning vent. A table held 2 chairs and a sealed envelope containing their topic. Maya dropped into one chair, while Emma carefully took the other, leaving as much space between them as possible. Mrs. Peterson followed them in, her sensible shoes clicking on the tile floor. "You have 20 minutes to prepare once you open your topic envelope," she explained, checking her watch. "Remember, this is about teamwork and presentation. You'll need to work together to advance to finals." She gave them both a pointed look before leaving the room. The envelope sat between them like a landmine. Emma reached for it first, her fingers trembling slightly as she broke the seal. She pulled out the paper and read aloud in a soft voice. "Resolved. Nature versus nurture. Which has the greater impact on human development?" Maya let out a sharp laugh, more bitter than amused. The sound made Emma flinch. The irony was devastating. Here they were, identical twins, separated at birth, raised in completely different environments, about to debate the very forces that had shaped their lives. Emma stared at her color-coded note card, suddenly feeling like all her careful preparation meant nothing. Maya slouched further in her chair, her pen tapping against the blank paper in front of her. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing second. Through the prep room's small window, they could see fragments of the audience filing into their seats. Susan's perfect posture was visible in the front row. Danielle's distinctive blazer could be spotted further back. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 15 minutes left to prepare. Emma cleared her throat. "We should probably—" She started, but her voice trailed off. Maya's pen stopped tapping. She looked at Emma for the first time, really looked at her, at the face that was so eerily like her own, yet somehow belonged to a stranger. The face that represented everything she'd lost, everything she'd never had. "Nature," Maya said suddenly, her voice flat. "I'll argue for nature." Emma nodded slowly. "Then I'll take nurture." Of course she would. It was what she knew. Careful guidance, structured love, deliberately crafted opportunities. They worked in near silence, occasionally exchanging clipped sentences about transition points and rebuttals. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, but beneath it ran something else, a current of understanding that neither girl was ready to acknowledge. A knock at the door made them both jump. The stage manager poked his head in, headset slightly askew. 5 minutes, he announced. "You'll be up right after Team 6 finishes." Emma stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. Maya pushed back her chair, the scraping sound harsh in the quiet room. They could hear applause from the auditorium as Team 6 finished their presentation. The stage manager appeared again, gesturing for them to follow him to the wings. Standing in the darkness beside the stage, Emma and Maya waited. The spotlights cast long shadows at their feet. Neither looked at the other, but their breathing had fallen into the same rhythm, something neither of them noticed but everyone else would. "Team 7, the stage manager whispered. "You're up." The stage lights blazed to life, casting a warm glow across the polished wooden podium. Emma stood tall, her navy blazer catching the light as she adjusted the microphone. The audience settled into an expectant hush, programs rustling quietly in hands. "When we consider the age-old question of nature versus nurture," Emma began, her voice clear and measured, "we must acknowledge the profound impact of environment on human development." Her words flowed with practiced precision, each point building carefully on the last. She cited studies about childhood development, about how love and stability shape young minds. Maya stepped forward next, her posture a mirror of Emma's, though her blazer was slightly wrinkled and her tie loosened. While environment plays its part, she countered, her voice carrying a sharp edge, we cannot ignore the fundamental truth of genetic inheritance. She spoke about DNA, about traits passed down through generations, about instincts that couldn't be taught. The audience watched, transfixed, as the two girls circled each other's arguments. At first, their exchange felt clinical, rehearsed, two opponents following debate protocol. Emma's points were polished, delivered with textbook precision. Maya's rebuttals came quick and cutting, each word carefully chosen to challenge. But then something shifted. Emma paused, really listening to Maya's words about genetic memory, about the pull of blood and bone. Her next response was softer, more personal. While nurture shapes our opportunities, she said, her voice carrying a new warmth, perhaps nature gives us the tools to recognize ourselves in others. Maya's shoulders relaxed slightly. She leaned forward, engaging with Emma's point rather than attacking it. And while nature determines our starting point, she added, her tone losing its defensive edge, nurture gives us the chance to choose our direction. Their rhythm began to change. Where before they had traded separate arguments, now their points wove together like a dance. Emma would start a thought, and Maya would complete it. Maya would raise a question, and Emma would offer the answer. The audience leaned forward in their seats. Students who had been doodling in their notebooks now watched with rapt attention. Even the judges set down their scoring sheets, caught up in the unusual dynamic unfolding before them. Consider identical twins, Emma said, her voice steady despite the personal weight of the words. Born with the same genetic blueprint. But shaped by different circumstances, Maya continued, meeting Emma's gaze for the first time. Nature gives them the same starting line. While nurture creates different paths, Emma added, her voice softening. Their words began to overlap, to harmonize. It wasn't debate anymore. It was dialogue. Two voices finding their way to a shared truth. We inherit more than just genes, Maya said, her usual guardedness giving way to something more vulnerable. We inherit possibilities, Emma responded, her practiced polish melting into genuine emotion. The audience sat perfectly still, caught in the spell of their synchronized delivery. Some students wiped at their eyes, moved by the raw honesty emerging from what should have been an academic exercise. As they approached their conclusion, their voices merged into perfect unison. We are shaped by where we come from, but we're defined by who we choose to find. The auditorium erupted in applause. Students stood, clapping and wiping tears. Teachers exchanged meaningful glances. In the back, Susan and Danielle sat frozen in their seats, both recognizing that something profound had just transpired between their daughters. Backstage, away from the thunderous applause, Emma and Maya found themselves alone in the dim light of the wings. Props and set pieces cast long shadows around them. The air felt thick with unspoken words. They sat on two folding chairs, neither looking directly at the other. The silence stretched between them, full of everything they'd just shared on stage. Finally, Maya broke the quiet. Her voice was barely above a whisper, stripped of its usual defenses. I don't know who I am without you. Emma nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. Their identical profiles cast matching shadows on the wall behind them, finally in perfect alignment. Emma sat cross-legged on her window seat, her debate uniform still crisp despite the long day. The moon cast silvery shadows across her bedroom floor as she absently traced patterns on the cool glass. Her mind kept circling back to Maya's words from the debate, each syllable etched in her memory like a photograph. The sudden buzz of her phone made her jump, an unknown number, a voice note. Her heart quickened as she pressed play, holding the phone close to her ear. Maya's voice came through, barely above a whisper but unmistakable. I can't stop hearing your laugh in my head. There was a pause, a shaky breath. I hated you because I thought you had everything. But you lost me too. Emma's hands trembled as she listened to the message again, then a third time. The raw honesty in Maya's voice made her throat tight. Without overthinking it, she grabbed her sketchbook and tore out a page, quickly drawing two simple stick figures standing together in the rain, their stick hands linked. She snapped a photo and sent it back to the number. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, appeared again. Emma held her breath. A response came, a rough sketch of 2 identical flowers growing from a crack in concrete. Emma smiled, her eyes misty. That first exchange opened a floodgate. The next evening, Emma lay in bed when another message arrived. This time, a voice note of Maya describing her favorite hiding spot in her old apartment building, a tiny nook behind the stairwell where she used to read. Emma sent back her own secret, how she sometimes sang to herself in Spanish, trying to connect with a heritage she barely understood. Maya responded with a recording of herself humming a lullaby their birth mother used to sing. During school hours, they maintained their distance. In the hallways, they passed like strangers, eyes carefully averted. But each night, their phones lit up with shared confessions and dreams. Maya sent a detailed drawing of what she imagined their first birthday looked like, 2 identical babies in matching yellow onesies. Emma responded with a story about how she used to pretend she had a secret twin living in another dimension. "What's your favorite ice cream?" Emma typed one night. "Rocky Road," Maya replied. "You?" "Same," Emma wrote back, and they both sent laughing emojis. They exchanged pictures of their rooms, their favorite books, their most treasured possessions. Maya shared a photo of her mother's old charm bracelet. Emma sent a picture of her first ballet shoes. Late one night, they started planning their perfect twin day, just for them. Maya suggested starting with breakfast at a tiny diner she knew, where the pancakes were as big as plates. Emma added that they could visit the botanical gardens where no one from school ever went. They drafted a detailed schedule, knowing it might never happen, but finding joy in the planning itself. "We could wear matching outfits," Emma suggested in a voice note. "Nothing fancy," Maya replied quickly. "Maybe just jeans and t-shirts?" "Deal," Emma agreed, smiling in the dark. They drew pictures of what they imagined it would look like. Stick figures with wild, curly hair eating ice cream, feeding ducks, lying in the grass watching clouds. Their shared artwork became a digital scrapbook of possibilities. Some nights they just sent each other music, songs that made them think of each other, melodies that expressed what they couldn't say in words. Maya introduced Emma to jazz. Emma shared her classical playlist. Their messages grew more honest, more vulnerable. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we stayed together?" Emma asked one night. "Every day," Maya replied, "but then I wouldn't be me and you wouldn't be you." They created their own private language of doodles and symbols. A star meant thinking of you. A cloud meant having a hard day. A simple heart meant I understand. Just before midnight, Emma's phone buzzed one final time. It was Maya's latest drawing. 2 identical hearts, cracked down the middle but carefully stitched together with delicate thread. Emma stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything it represented. With careful fingers, she saved it as her home screen, a secret reminder of their growing connection hidden in plain sight. The moon had shifted in the sky, casting new shadows across Emma's room. She held her phone close to her chest, the glow of the screen illuminating her smile in the darkness. Their shared secret felt like a treasure, precious and fragile and completely their own. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the muted sound coming from Maya's phone. Danielle had just walked in to make herself a cup of tea when she noticed the device sitting there, screen still glowing. She might have ignored it, but Emma's voice, clear and sweet, floated up from the speaker. "I miss you so much, Maya. Today in class I kept wanting to turn around and see if you were—" Danielle's hand froze above the phone. Her chest tightened as she realized what she was hearing. Before she could process it fully, Maya's footsteps thundered down the stairs. Maya burst into the kitchen, then stopped dead when she saw Danielle standing over her phone. The color drained from her face. "How long have you been talking to her?" Danielle's voice was eerily calm. Maya's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "That's private." "Private?" Danielle's eyebrows shot up. "After everything that family put us through? After what Susan tried to do to you?" "Emma's different," Maya shot back. "She's not like them." "She is them," Danielle's voice rose. She's been raised in their world, with their values, their expectations. She's my sister, Maya shouted, her voice cracking. My actual sister, the only person who knows what it feels like to be me. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Danielle took a step back, wounded. I've been here for you, she said quietly. Every day since your mother. But you're not her. Maya's eyes filled with tears. And you're not Emma either. Emma knows me better than you do. She feels what I feel. When we're together, it's like I'm finally whole. Danielle's face hardened. She picked up Maya's phone and held it tight. This stops now. You're grounded. No phone, no computer except for schoolwork. And I'm driving you to and from school myself. Maya's mouth fell open. You can't do that. I can and I am. Danielle straightened her shoulders. And there's something else you should know. That job offer in Atlanta? I'm taking it. The fight seemed to drain out of Maya all at once. She stood very still, her face going blank. We're moving? Her voice was barely a whisper. In 3 weeks, Danielle confirmed. A clean break, no more drama, no more Emma. Maya didn't argue, didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Okay. Something about her quiet acceptance made Danielle uneasy, but she pushed the feeling aside. This was for the best. It had to be. Go to your room, she said firmly. We'll talk more tomorrow. Maya turned without another word and walked upstairs. Danielle watched her go, then moved to the kitchen drawer where she kept important papers. She placed Maya's phone inside and locked it with a small key. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Danielle made her way to the living room window and watched storm clouds gathering over the city. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the glass. Up in her room, Maya sat on her bed in the dark, listening to the storm build. Her face remained expressionless as she pulled a small backpack from under her bed and began to fill it with essentials. When the thunder cracked overhead at midnight, she moved to her window with practiced silence and pushed it open. The rain was coming down hard now, but Maya didn't hesitate. She swung one leg over the sill, then the other, finding the familiar foothold on the drainpipe. Within moments, she had disappeared into the stormy night, leaving only her empty room behind. The doorbell's chime pierced the quiet house at 2:12 a.m., making Susan bolt upright in bed. Her heart raced as she threw on her silk robe, cinching it tight around her waist. Thunder rumbled outside as she hurried down the curved staircase, her bare feet silent on the hardwood steps. Through the frosted glass panels of the front door, she could make out a small, dark figure. Susan's hand trembled slightly as she turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. Maya stood there, completely drenched. Her clothes clung to her thin frame, dark curls plastered to her face. Water dripped steadily onto the welcome mat. Her eyes were wide and glassy, but she didn't make a sound. She just stood there, shivering. Susan didn't hesitate. She reached out and gently pulled Maya inside, closing the door against the howling wind. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, wrapping her arms around the soaked girl. Maya's wet clothes immediately dampened Susan's robe, but she didn't care. "Let's get you warm," Susan said softly, leading Maya up the stairs. In the guest bathroom, she wrapped Maya in their fluffiest towels and helped her dry off. She disappeared briefly into Emma's room and returned with a pair of soft flannel pajamas, Emma's favorites with the little stars on them. Maya changed silently, her movements mechanical. Susan gathered up the wet clothes and dropped them in the laundry basket, then guided Maya back downstairs to the living room. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, a floorboard creaked above them. Emma stood at the top of the stairs in her own matching star pajamas, frozen mid-step. Her eyes locked with Maya's. For what felt like minutes, neither girl moved. They just stared at each other, recognition and pain and longing passing between them like an electric current. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, Emma flew down the stairs and threw her arms around her twin. Maya's composure finally broke. She grabbed Emma back just as fiercely, burying her face in her sister's shoulder. They clung to each other, swaying slightly, neither speaking a word. Their breathing synchronized naturally as if their bodies remembered a rhythm from long ago. Susan stood back, watching through tear-filled eyes as the girls held each other. After a while, she quietly guided them both to the plush sectional sofa. She grabbed the softest throw blanket, the oversized chenille one they used for movie nights, and draped it over both girls. Maya's eyes were growing heavy, the adrenaline clearly wearing off. Susan sat down and gently pulled Maya's head into her lap. Emma curled up on Maya's other side, their hands still clasped together under the blanket. Susan stroked Maya's damp curls, humming softly as she had done for Emma countless times before. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the Langford living room, time seemed to stand still. Hours passed in comfortable silence. Susan watched the sky gradually lighten through the windows, pink and gold streaks painting the clouds as dawn approached. Around 9 a.m., angry pounding on the front door shattered their peaceful bubble. Maya jerked awake, her body going rigid with tension. Emma squeezed her hand tighter. Susan rose slowly and walked to the door, already knowing who she would find. She opened it to reveal Danielle, still in yesterday's work clothes, her face a mask of fury. "Where is she?" Danielle demanded, trying to push past Susan into the house. Susan held her ground. "She's safe," she said firmly. "She came here on her own. She's a child. You had no right to keep her here without telling me." Danielle's voice rose sharply. "She needed somewhere to feel safe," Susan replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And she chose here." "Chose?" Danielle laughed bitterly. "She's 11 years old. She doesn't get to choose to run away in the middle of the night." "Maybe if you hadn't threatened to move her across the country away from her sister," Susan started. "Her sister?" Danielle cut in. "The sister she didn't even know existed until 2 months ago? The sister whose mother tried to turn mine into some kind of charity case?" "That's not what I was trying to do," Susan protested. "No?" Danielle's eyes flashed. "The expensive clothes, the etiquette classes, the constant attempts to remake her in Emma's image? What would you call that?" Susan took a deep breath. "I made mistakes," she admitted. "But separating them again isn't the answer, which is why I'm filing for emergency temporary joint custody." Danielle went very still. When she spoke again, her voice was ice cold. "If you think any court is going to side with you over her legal guardian, you're delusional. And if by some miracle they do..." She leaned in close. "I'm gone, and I'm taking Maya with me." She spun on her heel and stormed down the front walk. Susan watched her go, then slowly closed the door. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and scrolled to her lawyer's number. Behind her, Maya and Emma sat huddled together on the couch, their identical faces reflecting the same fear as they watched Susan dial. Inside the family court of Dane County, the morning light filtered weakly through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Maya sat rigid between Danielle and Susan, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The wooden bench creaked softly as Emma shifted behind them, her patent leather shoes tapping nervously against the floor. The courtroom had that distinct smell of furniture polish and anxiety. Maya's heart thundered in her chest as she watched the attorneys arrange their papers, the shuffle of documents echoing in the hushed room. Danielle's attorney stood first, her navy suit crisp and authoritative. "Your Honor, Ms. Langford's interference has created chaos in an already delicate situation. Maya was adjusting well to her new life with her aunt until these disruptions began." Susan's shoulders tensed visibly. Her attorney, a gentle-faced woman with steel-gray hair, rose next. "What we have here, Your Honor, is a child who literally ran through a storm to find connection. Maya's actions speak volumes about her emotional needs." The arguments continued, words like stability and attachment floating through the air like arrows. Maya felt each one land. She watched Emma's reflection in the polished table surface, saw her twin's fingers twisting anxiously in her lap. "We call Maya Green to the stand," the judge announced, his voice kind but firm. Maya's legs felt like lead as she stood. Danielle squeezed her hand briefly, while Susan offered an encouraging nod. The walk to the witness stand seemed to take forever. The oath felt strange on her tongue. The leather chair creaked as she settled into it, her hands gripping the wooden rails. "Are you comfortable, Maya?" the judge asked, leaning forward slightly. Maya nodded, then remembered to speak. "Yes, Your Honor." "Would you like to tell us how you're feeling about this situation?" Maya's throat felt dry. She looked at Emma, then at Danielle, then at Susan. The words she'd practiced in her head all week suddenly seemed inadequate. "Everyone keeps saying who I belong to," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, then stronger. "But I belong to someone before either of them. Her, my twin, the one I didn't know I needed until I met her." The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter's fingers stilled on her keyboard. "I don't want to choose," Maya continued, her voice growing steadier. "I already did. I chose her." Emma's quiet sob broke the silence. Maya watched a tear roll down her sister's cheek, matching her own. The judge called a recess for deliberation. The minutes stretched like hours as they waited. Maya sat between her families, feeling the weight of both worlds pressing in on her. When the judge returned, his face was thoughtful. After careful consideration of all factors, including Maya's compelling testimony, this court rules for shared legal custody. Maya felt Danielle stiffen beside her. "Maya will continue her primary residence with Ms. Green," the judge continued, "but Ms. Langford and Emma will have protected, scheduled access, including weekends, holidays, birthdays, and summer breaks. This arrangement is non-negotiable and final." 3 months later, the transformation was visible. The Langford living room glowed with warmth from the crackling fireplace. Maya and Emma sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, wearing matching star-patterned pajamas. A birthday cake decorated with twin butterflies sat between them, 13 candles flickering. "Make a wish," Susan said softly, her phone ready to capture the moment. The girls closed their eyes, leaned forward in perfect sync, and blew out the candles together. Smoke curled up in delicate spirals as Danielle handed them a carefully wrapped box. Together they pulled the ribbon loose. Inside lay 2 silver heart lockets, designed to snap together at the edges. Emma lifted hers out first, the chain catching the firelight. "It doesn't match perfectly," Emma observed, trying to align the edges. Maya smiled, holding up her half. "Neither do we. That's how you know it's real." From the doorway, Susan watched them, her eyes glistening with tears. Her whispered words were barely audible. "God didn't just give me a daughter. He gave me back the part of her I never knew was missing." The girls snapped their lockets together, creating one complete heart, imperfect at the seams, but whole in all the ways that mattered. If you enjoyed the story of Emma, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Addered. If you enjoyed the story of Emma, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.